Okay. Dzień dobry i dobry wieczór. Serdecznie witam wszystkich i dziękuję za przyłączenie się do naszej dzisiejszej dyskusji. Good morning, afternoon, and evening. My name is Carolina Meichu, and I'm an assistant professor of German at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today on behalf of the Polish Studies Association, the PSA. And I just want to say a few words about the PSA to begin. So we are an organization of scholars, publishers, librarians, archivists, and journalists who specialize in the history, culture, art, politics, economics, and society of Poland. So basically anything that has anything to do with Poland. The PSA sponsors the online discussion forum Age Poland, as well as a number of awards, such as an article prize, a book prize, a graduate student travel award, and other kind of prizes and awards. We also sponsor events such as this one, and we usually have panels at the AC's annual conference that we co-sponsor. So if you're not yet a member of the PSA, I want to encourage you to join us, and I will drop a link in the chat later on. And if you're attending AC's this fall, please look out for more announcements on co-sponsored panels, as well as our membership meeting, which is open to everyone. And just to let you know again, for those of you who have just joined us, this meeting is being recorded and will be available later on at the PSA's YouTube channel, where you can also find some recordings of previous events. We've assembled here today in this transnational and translocal space to discuss Jan Musekamp's book, Shifting Lines, Entangled Borderlands, Mobilities and Migration Along the Prussian Eastern Railroad, which was published earlier this year with Indiana University Press. And to get us started, I would like to invite Bethany Mowry, the acquisitions editor at Indiana University Press, to say a few words about the East European list at IU and highlight a few aspects of Jan's book. And thank you for joining us today, and welcome, Bethany.
Thank you so much, Carolina, and thanks to everybody for coming here. This is always really exciting when you get to not just publish a fantastic book, but you get to have these kind of firsthand experiences and get to see people really just engaging with it and being, here for it. That's always very delightful to have. And I think you guys are going to enjoy this one. This is a fantastic project. So as Carolina said, I am an acquisitions editor at Indiana University Press. Specifically, the two lists of mine that are most relevant here are that I acquire titles in East European, Slavic, and Eurasian studies, and I also acquire titles in global and international studies. We publish around 75 books a year, and between those two fields, that's at least 10% of the list. So we have quite a few books that fall into this net, and we tend to cast our net rather wide. However, we do tend to have more books in our backlist that are skewing more towards the modern era, so 19th century onwards. We have a growing list of studies about not just migration, but also mobility and discussing sort of the connections between those. And we also have several publications about railroads, though they do admittedly favor more Americentric perspectives on railroads. But I think just saying those few things makes it pretty clear that, we were pretty excited to get Jan's proposal. And we were doubly excited because he had actually co-edited a volume with us in 2014, Migration and Mobility in the Modern Age. And I'd heard nothing but good things about working with the co-editors for that volume. And Jan had told me that he had enjoyed working with us as well. So that never hurts. This manuscript was actually one of the first ones that I got to internally review because I started at the press in July of 2022. And so this was kind of waiting for me there because they knew that they were hiring for the position. They wanted to get the new editor's take on this one. And I was delighted to get to look at this one because I think that there are a lot of things that stand out about this project and that I think stand out particularly on rereads. We were actually chatting before this, and Keely had mentioned that, I reread this again and got even more stuff out of it. This is a deceptively dense book because on the one hand, it has this fabulous clarity of prose and also just this very clear sense of who is this book speaking to? What interventions is it making within the field? What themes is it drawing on? If you're looking at this book and you haven't gotten the chance to read it yet, I highly recommend if you just want to dip your toes in the introduction, there's his section where he outlines, yep, Carolina's got it, he outlines these red threads that are these thorough lines. And just right away, that's something that tells you that this is an author who has mastery of their subject. They know where they're going. They know what's compelling about this, and does a fantastic job really making those substantive throughout. I also personally have a soft spot for projects that look at history in kind of unexpected places or from kind of fresh perspectives. And Jan's project really makes a point of saying, we're looking at these spaces where you have this meeting of people, but we're not just looking at sort of these large nexuses of meeting. We're looking at sort of the smaller sort of nodal points that really form the basis of that network, of those connections. One of the phrases I know that he used that kind of made my little antenna perk was global locality, which I think is absolutely compelling and is a real strength of this project. And last but not least, the source base for this book is nothing short of impressive. We've got a rich archival basis here that has been also added to with diaries of travelers, guidebooks. There's some literary and fictional ties. The aesthetics of the railroad itself are a really strong part of this. And so I know that when I, as an editor, see somebody who is handily using such a wide array of sources, that's another thing that tells me this is a project that is going to be a strong contribution to several fields and is going to be just something that a lot of people will be able to access. And so, yeah, this was a very easy project to get excited about. And it was delightful to get to work with Jan on this project as it went through review and through publication. And we're really proud to have it on our list.
Thank you very much, Bethany, for this lovely introduction of the broader context of the book. And I will now introduce the panelists, and then I will invite them to speak for about 7 to 10 minutes each. And then afterwards, Jan will respond, and we'll have a discussion among the panelists. And then I will open up the floor for questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, you can either hold on to them and raise your hand later on, or you can drop them in the chat while the discussion is going on, and we'll get to them later. So with that said, I would like to introduce the panelists, and I'm going to do this very briefly, and one could, of course, say a lot more about each of them, but I really want to give us more time for discussion. So our first panelist is Leslie Page Moch, Professor Emerita of History at Michigan State University. She is the author of many important books and edited volumes on migration and migration history, including Moving Europeans, Migration in Western Europe since 1650, as well as the co-authored Broad as My Native Land, Repertoires and Regimes of Migration in Russia's 20th century. From 2004 to 2016, she was also co-editor of the Studies in World Migration series for the University of Illinois Press. Dr. Moch's latest book, published last year, is Making National Diasporas, Soviet-Era Migrations and Post-Soviet Consequences. Our second panelist is Keely Stouter-Halstead. She's professor of history and Haina Family Chair in the History of Poland at the University of Illinois in Chicago, where she directs programming in Polish studies. Her teaching and research examine issues of ethnicity, gender, and class in East Central Europe. Dr. Stouter-Halstead has published on topics ranging from peasant nationalism to Polish-Jewish relations, prostitution, and human trafficking. And here I'd like to especially point to her 2015 book, The Devil's Chain, Prostitution and Social Control in Partitioned Poland. In her recent work, she investigates the end of empire in East Central Europe, focusing on refugees, border changes, and population movements in the Polish Second Republic immediately following World War I. Gregor Thum is our next panelist, and he's Associate Professor of History at the University of Pittsburgh. And among other things, he's known for his work on the history of the city of Wrocław. His book, Uprooted, How Breslau Became Wrocław During the Century of Expulsions, has been published in German, English, and Polish. In 2021, he published a chapter titled Sea Power and Frontier Settlement, Friedrich List's American Vision for Germany, in the volume German and United States Colonialism in a Connected World, Entangled Empires. And I mentioned this particular chapter here because List is something of a recurring character in Jan's book. And currently, Dr. Thum is working on a book project titled Mastering the East, the German Frontier from 1800 to the Present, which is a study on the history of the German border in the East. And finally, of course, we have Jan Musekamp, the author of Shifting Lines, Entangled Borderlands. And I just want to say a few words about him as well. So Jan previously taught history. Jan is visiting associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh. He previously taught Eastern European history at the European University of Viadrina and Frankfurt an der Oder in Germany. His first book focused on forced migrations and cultural appropriation in the Polish border city of Szczecin between 1945 and 2005. And of course, he is already working on a next research project. And in this one, he deals with the global migrations of Ukraine's German speakers as they unfold in a time of drastically changing migration policies and shifting ideas of borders, race, and belonging. And last but not least, Jan is also the co-convener together with me of the Polish Studies Association. And with these introductions, I'd like to thank you all again for being here today and hand it over to our panelists, beginning with Leslie Moch.
Thank you, Carolina. I'm happy to be here and yet able to talk with all of you at such a distance. Because I'm the generalist on this panel as a historian of migrating Europeans in the early modern and modern Western Europe and Russia's 20th century. So I've decided that the appropriate thing to do is to characterize the history of 19th century migration, then tackle the question of what does Jan's new book do for scholars and students who do not know the area or its migration history? What will they take away from a study that is ostensibly about how the Ostbahn became a transnational force in a nationalizing world? The century between the fall of Napoleon and the outbreak of World War I was a century of heightened migration. Changing patterns of landholding in combination with high fertility expanded a rural proletariat without secure work on the land. Rural industry suffered with mechanization of production of textiles, metals, and tools. This enlarged rural proletariat undertook the unprecedented expansion of urban populations in coal towns, iron and steel mills, and administrative and commercial centers. Others joined large groups of seasonal laborers hired to harvest or construct new buildings. To these mobilities, I add departures from Europe as millions headed for North America, South America, and Australia. Initiated by the English, Irish, and German immigrants, late century immigrants saw a surge of Italians, Poles, and Jews from the Russian Empire. Yet the Russian Empire forbade and restricted migration, depending on who you were. Jan complicates and enriches this history of migration in this period in three ways that I found very striking. He focuses on the journey, the travel, and the physicality of the train itself. Coincidentally, I've taken in two family histories of Latvian Jews in the past month, neither of which provided any information, knowledge, or even speculation about the crucial and perhaps fraught and long-distance initial journeys overland to the port of Bremen or Hamburg or any port. Moreover, a revolution in transportation made such journeys possible. A revolution built on the emerging field of civil engineering, international communications among railroad developers and financiers. They were all swept up in the development of this new mode of travel that changed commerce and military deployment. Thus, the migrants, whether bound for the industries of the Ruhr from East Prussia or for the US from Lithuania, experienced a widely shared new technology that changed travel, much as commercial aviation changed American travel after World War II. Jan also points to the varieties of experience in his emphasis on multiple mobilities, with the rich payoff of a greater understanding of what it meant to be on the move. Opening with travel accounts by Dostoevsky and the poor Jewish immigrant who crossed the border under fire after desertion from his so-called guide. We are able to appreciate the class differences in travel reflected in the wide range of station facilities and train accommodations for the first class down to the fourth class travelers. He expands with contrast between Nabokov's trips to the Côte d'Azur and Diaghiliev's city hopping with the Ballet Russe on one hand, with family histories of the poor making their way to port cities by hook or by crook, increasingly with aid, but also increasingly under control of the shipping companies. I contend that the study of people on the move benefits from an explicit focus on the range of experience. Historically, no study of poor provincial newcomers in a city like Paris, for example, is complete without the inclusion of their wealthy and often charitable compatriots whose lives were much more secure. Within Journeys, Jan emphasizes the importance of nodes of border crossing, of borderscapes where the tension of travel meets sides of control and a transnational border culture. This telling line of observation has great potential for further development as an extension of borderland studies. Jan remarked that for immigrants from Imperial Russia, Kunin was halfway to the US in the mental map of immigrants. Once past that, they felt they were likely to make the trip. Exiles from the same empire had a very different experience and a very different response to reaching the spot where they would cross into Siberia, according to George Kennan's description in his 1880s study of Siberia and the exile system. This node of border crossing brought on palpable despair. More ambiguous was the guarded border on the Danube River between the Ottoman and Habsburg empires, managed by imperial, provincial, and local actors in the 18th century. Their job was to police the river and islands in order to prevent smuggling and to exclude would-be newcomers infected with the plague. So the expansion of facilities that Jan delineates so well in his book included quarters for mandatory quarantine. In the case of the Amur River dividing the USSR from China in the 20th century, whole colonies of Cossacks were settled to provide security, and the riverside border culture included merchants on both sides and ferry personnel. Emphasis on the train itself, dramatic class and ethnic differences in the experience of mobility, and the focus on nodal points reflect some of the 5 red threads that unite this study. Another thread, microhistories and research informed by intimate local knowledge, is beyond the generalist. Musekamp was able first to trace the Ostbahn's history as he was an exchange student in Poland, later as a researcher briefly interned by a Russian border patrol, and as the leader of a student field trip. His photos illustrate the book. This tactile knowledge of the territory, of Eidkunen, of the critical bridge at Dachau, of border stations, train terminals, and their neighborhoods, render this history all the more irresistible. Finally, I must say that this history has a tragic but compelling denouement, as the transnationalism achieved with the Ostbahn at its heart gave way to the violent nationalism of the 20th century. As Karl Schlöger wrote, Jan captured the creation of a multidimensional space in Europe, a space that would be ruined in the catastrophes of the 20th century. At the end, a reader learns precisely how these catastrophes shape mobility to the present day, a disappointment for humanity, but also an extraordinarily fine, entangled history. That's it.
Thank you, Leslie. And now I'll hand it over to Keely.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for those wise interventions, much of which I kind of worked through when I used the book last semester in my graduate seminar on migration. And thank you to Jan and Carolina for asking me to participate in this panel, which gave me the opportunity to look back through the book and remind myself of how rich and complex and innovative it is. So I just want to go through a handful of sort of general interventions that I saw with new eyes, fresh and innovative ways of looking at things that Jan is able to tease out of his evidence. And it's partially because he places the railroad at the center of the narrative, and then he examines how things intersect with that railroad, which gives us a much sort of broader landscape to work with. So 3 of these are sort of general scholarly observations, and the 4th pertains more specifically to those people in our audience who are scholars of modern Poland. To begin with, and this is already alluded to by Bethany, the sheer quantity of information that is squeezed between these covers is so impressive, but it's also, so it's rich, it's detailed, there's so many data points, but it's also very accessible and readable because it's all part of a wound into a moving, gripping story. So as a couple of examples, I want to time myself 1 second. We learn about how these railroads were financed. We learn about their architectural design of the different stations. We become familiar with the timetables and the speed of travel and how that speed of travel changes over time and the length of time it takes to get between 2 points on the railway and how that shifts over time. We read about how the railway stations were built, by whom, and why that mattered to the lives of the workers on the ground. And we learn of the differing prices of horses that were smuggled between the Russian Empire and Prussia, and myriad of other examples of information. I would suggest that this book is going to become a treasure trove to any number of scholars in a variety of fields for a long time to come. And that's partially because of the, as Bethany pointed out, the rich variety and scope of materials that Jan uses. And then more broadly speaking, and again touching on something that Leslie alluded to, one of the most remarkable things about Jan's intervention is the way that he plays on the theme of borderlands. So for him, borderlands, border towns, border stations are places of human fluidity. They are sites where competing empires come into contact, but where also the personnel at border stations is a mixture of ethnic backgrounds, social classes, overlapping political power. He sees borderlands as often transformative sites, places where peasants become workers and agricultural lands become industrial terrain. Border communities, in his writing, bring together conflicting political sentiments in this sort of a cacophony of languages, a chaos of goods being smuggled and ideas being debated and exchanged and moving across lines. But in his writing, what borderlines distinctly are not are necessarily sites of violence and ethnic conflict. In this sense, Jan's book moves our thinking beyond what had been alluded to as the shatter zones of empire and viewing borders as these sites of almost inevitable ethnic conflict and even genocidal violence in much of the work on our region. Instead, cultures here can blur or blend in any number of ways, but they do not necessarily need to seek to eliminate one another. And that, I think, gives sort of a fresh prism for us to analyze our region, which is full of complex border localities. Related to this, this book does a marvelous job of stressing the way that the border between cultural and economic spheres in Europe, that imagined border between East and West, becomes real to the passengers and to the people at these border stations, especially at Eidekunden and the Königsberg stations on that Prussian-Russian border. It was here, of course, that readers of travel guides learned what characterized the essential Russian or the paradigmatic German. And it was the very act of waiting for those railway gauges to be changed, or the experience of visa restrictions and border controls, of crossing into an area that was not Germany, that seems to have reinforced notions of, as Jan puts it, the self and other. All of this both affirms and challenges the conceptions of Larry Wolff that Eastern Europe, the conception of Larry Wolff that Eastern Europe is a region that was invented in the minds of 18th century travelers. In some senses, it was the residents themselves of the region, Russian subjects and Prussian subjects, who were responsible for the othering of the other side, othering of Western Europe and Russia, by contrasting local practices with what took place farther to the extremes on the rail line. So he kind of updates and refreshes and nuances Wolff's notion of how these borders were imagined by those on the ground. Next, I think Jan does a terrific job of viewing the transformation of social class and the eventual kind of hardening of lines between classes through the lens of his local actors. He demonstrates a global process that was unfolding in the 19th century in very detailed, concrete ways. I think he does this in at least two ways. First, by focusing on the local settings in which the Ostbahn stations were built. He demonstrates in a particularly evocative way, the transformation of rural settings and agricultural communities into industrial conglomerations with their built environment and shifting labor conditions. It's just, you can sort of feel yourself in the moment as these spaces are transformed in a very short period of time. Second, the book introduces us to the sort of a visible disaggregation of social classes. Jan emphasizes the introduction of leisure class travelers with their framework of hotels and spas, restaurants, and first-class waiting rooms. This is sort of a global social class that connects with others in different parts of Europe. But then there are also the second and third and fourth class migrants, the last of those being labor migrants or émigrés. And they travel separately. So they're in their different spheres, but they're all traveling on the same route. And in this sense, he offers us a visual representation of the parallel ways that social class plays out in a global sense. And then finally, all this brings me to what might seem like a contradictory trajectory between the globalizing, integrating goals of the Prussian Empire in building the railroad and the very real impact that the railway line had on facilitating nationalist organization across the lands of partitioned Poland. And this is a super important intervention, and it's a very innovative perspective on Polish nationalist movement. I think it's important to our members today that he demonstrates that the railway line becomes a key player in the 19th century Polish uprisings. The railway line was, of course, planned initially by the Prussians to bring together the disparate sections of Royal Prussia, including the renegade Polish districts, united into a more cohesive entity. It would instead prove instrumental in organizing the 1863 insurrection in many senses. And again, he maps these out in a very colorful way. Arms, ideas, and personnel were smuggled between Prussia and Russia in preparation for the uprising. Money was collected from Polish patriots inside Prussia and brought to Congress Poland. Cash trains were robbed to purchase arms. Ideas in the forms of books and magazines were transported across the Prussia-Russia frontier, effectively uniting those in all of these partitions who opposed Russian rule into a single movement. The railway played a key role in the strategy of the insurgents in that they sought to interrupt the telegraph lines. And it was, of course, also instrumental in the way that the Russians shut down the rising and that it was used to transport troops across the region to put it down. But then in the years following the insurrection, which is a little known thing, the railway stations and the railway line became key sites for bringing together Poles from all over the region. And they continued to debate and talk about ideas. And in this sense, I would say that Jan shows how the railway stations and the railway lines, by looking at them in this moment, how political borders did not always divide populations. Instead, he demonstrates how Polish speakers used the railroad as a source of communication and interaction, one that united rather than divided them. And that sort of indicates that those lines between empires, however much the empires tried, were more permeable and more open, more fluid than we have sometimes understood them to be. All of which brings me to my final point, which is a question I think I want to leave with Jan, and that maybe we can all discuss. Jan claims that the railroad itself is an independent actor in all of this, which is a super evocative and original way of framing it, one that has a life of its own and that impacts events as they unfold. The railway, he says, was an independent agent that helped Polish insurgents fight imperial control. But can inanimate objects or systems, such as the railroad, serve this function? Can the railway think, or is it simply a tool that all sides made use of, often without even acknowledging it? I would maintain that humans affect events in the region, that they smuggle and they confiscate arms, they move across fluid borders, they shape their ideas while interacting with travel guides and other sources of information. But can Jan convince us that the railroad itself is an autonomous agent? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keely. And finally, I would like to invite Gregor to give his thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me, having me in this panel. And I'm the last here in the row, so I can make it a bit shorter because some things were, of course, said already. But I want to focus on the spatial side of the book. It has been mentioned also by Leslie in the beginning. So this is, this book owes a lot to the spatial turn. And I think it's a model for space-sensitive history, space-sensitive history writing, and this in two ways. So Jan tells the history of the railroad through spaces, concrete spaces, the bridges, the railroad stations, and so on. But he also tells the history of a space, the transformation of a space. So these are just two sides, and I want to engage with a little bit. So when he tells the history of spaces, he just reminds us how important, seemingly unimportant things are structures like stations, bridges, the terminals, how they changed entire regions and how important they become really for the life experience of people. And how things like a bridge, like the famous Dirschau Bridge, itself is not just a bridge, but also an instrument to convey a political message, to lay a claim on a territory, connecting the bridge to its architecture, its iconography, with the claim of, of a Prussian civilizing or German civilizing mission here in those predominantly Polish lands. So he reminds us of all that, how important these places really are. And then he shows us that the railroad transformed spaces, and especially the space here in the East. And the Ostbahn is not just a railroad, it's a specific railroad. It's not a railroad that followed traditional trade routes that it was established following and then modernizing by just trade routes. This was really a state intervention here for strategic and military purposes to build a railroad to a less developed region here of the Prussian kingdom, and build the railroad with state funds because there was no business interested in that space to finance basically the railroad. But once the railroad was there, business was attracted. It came to the railroad. It reminds us today of, an airport built somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Once the airport is there, it will create, of course, also business and will restructure the space. And I think a railroad does this much more dramatically, actually, than an airport, to restructure the place. Because suddenly, for people, it changed their geographic orientation, their mental maps. Suddenly, people in a small village that was remote or a small town remote were suddenly connected to big metropoles. They suddenly could travel in hours, within hours, to Berlin or to Paris or to St. Petersburg, which was completely impossible before. This, of course, changed their mindset. Suddenly, they were living in a completely different geography. And this is, of course, an interesting piece also of economic history. Jan is not an economic historian per se, but of course, all these questions he dwells on have enormous historical economic impact also. And it shows also how important it is when we think about social history, about political history, that we also think about the economic sides of things. The railroad was an important factor of the economy here of these Eastern territories. And I too want to conclude with a question, and it's very similar to the question of Keely, because I'm also mostly struck by the idea that the railroad is a non-human actor. That's really a very provocative statement, and provocative in a good way, because it really makes us think, is that actually really true? Is the railroad an actor, or is not just people build the railroad and people control it? And I'm more convinced of it actually that it is, but I'd like Jan to go more into depth with that and explain this a little bit better. As I said, the railroad, the Ostbahn, was not created out of economic necessity, or but more political and strategic necessity, was created and and created also a space. Suddenly those territories were linked between Berlin and Königsberg, but also between Paris and Moscow, became a cohesive space. But we know that this space changed dramatically after the First and after the Second World War. Suddenly borders cut through the cohesive space the railroad had created. So the borders after the First World War, when Poland was recreated, and the so-called corridor, the railroad went through that. And then after the Second World War, with two new borders, with the shift of Poland westward, the railroad lost much of its significance, but not entirely. So it was now the railroad that cut or went through a fragmented space. And my question for Jan is, was the railroad rebellious? Did the railroad rebel against, was resistant against political incursions on the space and just be a fact that acted against that? So basically, while there was a political desire to fragment the space, that the railroad acted against it and put this place together again. And of course, we see this today. The railroad is mobilized again, is vitalized again today. And that's very interesting. So is it now human actors, or is just a certain path dependency that was created by the existence of the railroad, that railroad is now used and links again these places? We know, ever who studies Polish politics and history, we're always surprised to see these Polish election maps where the old borders just re-emerge so miraculously again, and people have been struggling for a long time to find really good explanations for it. And maybe the railroad is actually a part of it, because the railroad is a signifier of long existing and recently created trade routes. Is that actually also what links people? Because the railroad is part of mental maps of people in a region, and as such, maybe resists these short-term political incursions on existing spaces. With that, I want to end, and I'm hoping we have a nice conversation if we can bring more people in. And again, I want also to conclude with saying this is a fantastic book. It's very readable, and it's not just readable, it's actually a very important book, because there's so many questions we can ask about that book. Thank you very much, Jan, for writing that, and thank you very much, to allow us here to discuss it.
Thank you so much. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Jan.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the praise. It almost leaves me kind of speechless here. Yeah, I've worked a lot, couple years on this book, as you can see, and I'm really happy it's out. And I first of all, I want to thank Indiana University Press and Bethany for making it possible in your publishing house. It was a great honor to work with you. It was a very, very smooth process. So thank you for that. But I also want to thank all my fellow travelers on that line. Yeah. So literally travelers, but also, of course, those who did not travel but followed the book and how it emerged. And there's a couple of people in this Zoom room who, yeah, had a close look on how it came into being. And I'm so glad that there's a couple of people also from my time in Frankfurt Oder here, like Ella Szumańska, who worked with me in the early phases of the project. But there's also Piotr Kopyczynski, my old friend from Torun, from the exchange student year I spent there. So I'm really glad that social media seems to work here. And I'm very glad. And Bogdan Twardochleb from Szczecin, who followed my first book. So I'm very glad that you made it into this room. And there's also, of course, some dear colleagues from the University of Pittsburgh and from Poland, Germany. I'm glad you're all here. And then, of course, I want to thank the panelists. Yeah, so it is not without reason that you're here, since you all have read some of the chapters or all of the chapters, and it was also your input in those last couple of months before the book came out that it became a book. Yeah, with your help and your guidance, it became a real book. Yeah, so thank you all for that. Yeah, so Keely mentioned it is kind of a dense book. There's a lot of information, and be assured there's at least double that information in a folder that is on my computer that is called Killed Darlings. Yeah, so there's more information if you're interested. So I had to leave out, of course, a lot of the details, a lot of also the locally connected Ostbahn secrets, yeah, and that is something I'm happy to discuss also in another setting when I'm hopefully going to those places again and presenting the book and traveling again on the railroad, yeah. But yeah, I wanted to come back to some of the points you mentioned here, and one of the most important questions, and I've heard that already in another book presentation here at Pitt, the question, is the railroad really an independent actor? So is it an actor in its own right? Is it kind of acting autonomously, or is it just a tool? Yeah, and I would say, yeah, it's both. Yeah, but what makes it an independent actor in its own right is basically that it creates a space and possibilities that none of the creators had foreseen. Yeah, and that's what I mean with an autonomous actor. Yeah, so when they constructed the railroad, nobody's had kind of the idea or the projection that it would be a very important corridor for transatlantic migration, for example. Yeah, so nobody really anticipated that. People thought, yeah, that will be important for travelers traveling from the Russian Empire to Western Europe. That is an important kind of metropolitan corridor that will serve the affluent, and then, of course, it will serve trade. So the Prussian railroads actually had to add a fourth class, yeah, a couple of months into the completion of the railroad, which they hadn't anticipated before. And they added those carriages of fourth class, and for the first time with roofs, because before the fourth class was meant to just serve the local transportation. People would, let's say, go to the next bigger city and sell their goods. But now we could see that the railroad is kind of covering much longer distances. So people are covering longer distances. Yeah, so I would say, yeah, it is an actor in its own right. But of course, at every stage, it's then used as a tool by the people. Yeah, but first, it sets the stage. And I think it's sometimes important to look back at the railroad as really at the center, as the hero of this book. Yeah, so that was my idea behind. Yeah, and I mean, you could compare it with the discussions that are going on today with artificial intelligence. Yeah, so are computers, is that a tool? Yeah, or is it already an actor? Yeah, in its own right. And I think it's somewhat comparable. Yeah, so I think sometimes it's really worth changing the perspective and thinking about the possibilities. Somewhere I call it the space of possibilities that a new technological system is creating. And some of those possibilities are actually not anticipated by its creators. Yeah. So I think that's the main point I have here. I'm trying to make here. Yeah. And Gregor's absolutely right. So the railroad is kind of going against political change. It's going against the borders. Yeah. So after the First World War, when everything seems to kind of cut off this line between Germany and Poland, what we see miraculously is that the engineers on the Polish and the German side, they very quickly come to an agreement on how it can work. Yeah, despite the borders, despite the change of locomotives. Yeah, so there is this old idea. Yeah, I would say it's a myth that the so-called Polish corridor, so the Polish land that basically cuts through the former Ostbahn corridor, would kind of hinder transportation. Yeah, but the engineers on the ground, they found a way on the Polish and on the German side to make it happen. Yeah, so here we can see that the railroad is acting against the political changes that occurred after the First World War, and to some extent after the Second also. Yeah, but one of the reviewers, and it was not Leslie, suggested that I should expand the book until like after the Second World War, but I figured that is kind of a different story and a much more complicated story, because there we can see that it's really kind of cut off. Yeah, but not so much after the First World War. Yeah, so that's what I found out here. So I have this extensive chapter also on the interwar period and how everything is reconfigured. Yeah, it's not totally cut off, but it's reconfigured, and people are finding a way to cope with the change. Yeah. And yeah, if you look at the situation today, it's true. So those people living at this former Ostbahn corridor, so they have this kind of they take pride in this railroad line and in the history of it. yeah, because it has been such an important corridor. And I've seen that all over the place when I was traveling with students, even the smallest town and city along the line, they are fully aware of the importance of that line. And they don't see it as a Prussian or German line. They see it as, yeah, an important communication infrastructure, yeah? So it's not nationally connotated, yeah? And they see it as a chance, for example, today to get to Berlin quicker than by car, yeah? So they would park their car at the railroad stations to get there for work, yeah? So I would say to some extent, it's absolutely true. The railroad is resisting this reconfiguration, the political reconfiguration. And it's also much quicker than the politicians, yeah? So the politicians are still debating if they should kind of renew the second track on the German side. People are already taking this train, yeah? So the politicians are like kind of 10 years behind, yeah? And my good guess would be that in 10 years, we'll see, yeah, the old importance of that line almost restored, yeah? And it's much stronger than any political change and any borders that were erected along this corridor. And I even found that in Kaliningrad when we were traveling with the students. So they were so much aware of this important communication line, infrastructure line that would connect their piece of Russian land to Western Europe. Yeah, of course that is before the war, but they were very aware that that is what connects them to Western Europe, at least historically. Yeah. Yeah, and that also goes with what Keely said. So the line is acting as, or the people on the line, in a transnational fashion. So the line is actually a transnational infrastructural project connecting people. And once Europe is falling apart during the First World War, but also partly afterwards, it resisted to some extent. Yeah. So that's what I call somewhere, yeah, transformation or reconfiguration. Yeah, I think that's some of the comments here in this first round. Maybe one last comment. Gregor mentioned the idea of mental maps. Yeah, so the Ostbahn, of course, creates a mental map that is quite different to what people were thinking before. And it's not only that they have this possibility to travel now or to migrate less expensively, but it's changing their mindset also in the way that newspapers, information is traveling along this line. So you don't actually have to travel, yeah, but you will get the information from other travelers who come back from Berlin, or you get this information because now the newspapers come in like the next day from Berlin into the most remote part of yeah, the eastern provinces of Prussia. So that's also kind of part of this mental reconfiguration of space. Yeah, thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you very much. And I would like to add, as a literary scholar, I very much appreciate the idea of these mental maps also being created through, you know, a kind of poetic endowment of meaning of these spaces. So in that sense, the idea of the railroad here as an agent very much speaks to me, and we can find that in the literature, right, where it does become this kind of non-human actor, very much so. I want to ask maybe the panelists if they would like to respond or have further questions for Jan. And if that is not the case, then perhaps I'll open it to the audience, but of course everybody is invited to speak. So are there any questions right now from the audience? I'm going to try to manage this here in the chat.
And those questions can also be in Polish, of course, or in German.
I see one hand. Oh, Winston, go ahead.
Hi, Jan. I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but I was just wondering, and I'm in Austria right now. I'm in Vienna, and let me start my video. And you know, unfortunately, like on Austrian TV, all they talk about are rail lines to, that the Habsburgs built. And so I was just wondering, they just recently, there was a documentation on the Südbahn and how it connected Trieste, all the way to Vienna. So I was just wondering, which way is your railroad? I mean, you talked about how people didn't see it as nationally connotated, but how is it still an imperial railroad? And and in part of an imperial project. On the other hand, this isn't fair, but if you can make comparisons to other railroads, like in Austria-Hungary, for example, I appreciate that. Thanks.
Should I answer right away, or we collect questions?
I think you could answer, or unless Darius still is the question directly connected, or we could...
in a way, not
Okay, go
directly, but in a way, yeah. So I haven't read the book, unfortunately. Yeah, that was the reason I wanted to join the company, to listen about it. But with these comments about the long-term effects of the railroads built, many years ago, I think about what kind of comparison can we make to verify these claims? And I think that we have an opportunity, namely those railroad lines that are no longer in use for some 30 years or more. Means, do the abandoned lines act in a similar way as the lines that are still in operation? And some of the lines were dismantled right after the Second World War, taken by the Soviet army. So we have these ghost lines. We have this ghost railway station standing in the middle of nowhere. And have you thought about this comparison? About what are the effects of lines that have not existed for the last 70 years, for example, and those who have disappeared in the last 35 years, for example? So a general question about the present rather than the more distant past, but it quite intrigues me how it works.
Yeah, thank you so much. So maybe first to Winston's question about the imperial connection of the railroad line and maybe some comparisons to Habsburg railroad lines. Yeah, so I think you could write a similar story about railroad lines that would pass through Europe in the more southern section from connecting the Habsburg Empire to the Russian Empire. And that would be possible. You will also find similar development of entangled borderlands here. Yeah, so one of the important nodal points here that comes to mind, but there's a lot of been written about it, would be Brody, yeah, in Galicia, yeah, where we also have this kind of connection of important nodal point as for immigrants, but also for trade, yeah, and border crossing. So one of the reasons why I picked the Ostbahn is, first of all, it's a coincidence because I traveled that line a lot when I was a student in Torun. So I traveled the line multiple times from Berlin to Torun, and then also later on to Kaliningrad, and then to St. Petersburg. And so I had an intimate knowledge about this line. But then also I was intrigued by this Polish-German and Jewish, we have to add, kind of mix along this line, yeah, and how this goes together, especially in the case of the Ostbahn. So that was one of the reasons I was very much intrigued by this particular railroad line. And then also I started my research in Berlin, yeah. So for me, at least as a historian and researcher, the access to those archival materials was easier for me. So to some extent, it's a coincidence, but it turned out it was a great coincidence, yeah, because you can really show all those developments on this particular railroad line, yeah. Someone who would have been based in Vienna would probably take another stance, yeah. But yeah, as you know, some of those research projects develop out of very small projects. As in this case, I wanted to write an article because I was intrigued about this connection between Berlin and Kaliningrad or Königsberg, yeah. And then I soon figured out when I was doing the research in Berlin that, yeah, it also has this transnational dimension, yeah. And so, yeah, I really got into it, yeah. And that's one of the reasons I went here. Was it an imperial project? Is it still an imperial project? So when it was first discussed in the 1830s in Prussia, it was not so much seen as an imperial project. It was more seen as, bringing different parts of the country together. So that was in line with the discussions elsewhere, like in France, in Austria. Yeah. So at the same time, we have those early railroad pioneers who are thinking of especially the economic benefits, and then second also bringing people together, and then very soon also military benefits. Yeah. So geostrategic benefits that it would bring if you connect also the remote parts of the country. Yeah. And then that's the point where it turns into kind of an imperial project as well. Yeah. And that to some extent explains the difficulties the Prussians had when they were talking to their Russian counterparts, because they wanted to make it a European thing. Yeah. They wanted to connect the Russian Empire. Yeah. And the Russians probably were not that far at that point. They couldn't see that it would be a big economic benefit to them. But yeah, they soon understood, this railroad line will have a geostrategic importance. Yeah, so we will connect Poland, the Kingdom of Poland, by means of this railroad line, and then especially also the St. Petersburg-Warsaw railroad line, which is closely connected to this one. So yeah, from a more economic perspective, it soon turns into an imperial perspective. Yeah. And on both sides, and I would say it's a similar simultaneous development across Europe, and maybe even globally. So a colleague of mine, she's working on, and she's recently published a book on Indochina and the colonial railroads there, and we can see some very similar developments. Yeah, starting off as a railroad line that would connect the mining district to the port. Yeah, so that is the economic benefit. But then soon it turns also out that it is important to rule over the colonial parts of the territory. And if you translate that into the Prussian case, it is about connecting, and that's in the early discussions, connecting the Polish-speaking parts of the monarchy, with the German-speaking parts of the monarchy, sending German-speaking railroad workers here, employees, to connect it and to draw it closer to the metropole. That was one of the discussions in the 1840s. Yeah, so there's definitely also this imperial project to it. The legacy of it is probably not that imperial. I would say it's more, it has turned into, I would say, the perspective to the perspective of the people. Yeah. So how is it useful for people who are living there today? Yeah. So can we use that railroad line? And that leads me to the question by Darius Stola. How about railroad lines that no longer exist? So do they also still have an impact on the way people think and on the mental maps maybe? So the Ostbahn is an example where it was almost dismantled. Yeah, so the parts of the line after the Second World War, they were serving only regional traffic. Yeah, and we can see it only now that is again kind of crossing borders. Those are different borders today, of course, but it's again creating these transnational spaces. Yeah, it's again creating these entangled border spaces. Yeah, maybe not at the same nodal points as in the 19th century, but still the railroad is still there. As I said, it's gaining in importance economically, and it might also gain a new geostrategic importance, when you think of where the war material is now transported to Ukraine, So all the different means of transportation are needed in addition to what existed before. So the Ostbahn is one of those lines where the material is transported to the east.
Keely.
Yeah, Jan, I was just thinking about all that material that you put in that folder of dead soldiers or whatever, and what is included in that folder, what might you do with it, and what did you explicitly decide to leave out of your narrative, and would that have somehow changed the scope of the project if you've been able to include more?
Yeah, so one of the ideas I had very early on was looking at a village closer to Berlin, and to see how that railroad line would actually also change the life of people who are in the orbit of Berlin, in the immediate orbit. Yeah, like yeah, migration maybe, but more so economic impact. So at some point in that book, I mentioned the import of geese from the Russian Empire, yeah, as kind of a very important yeah, commodity at the time. And so what I was planning to do, but I couldn't really find enough material here, was to compare or to look into what that does to the local geese producers, yeah, in the orbit of Berlin. Yeah, because now we have a competition that is coming from the Russian Empire, yeah, that is hundreds of miles away, yeah. So how does it impact the production of geese in, yeah, like the orbit of Berlin, yeah? So what I figured, it doesn't do a lot, simply because Berlin is growing at a pace that you basically need everything you can get to feed the capital, yeah? So the geese producers in Brandenburg, they are prospering, and so are prospering those who are transporting their geese along the line into Berlin from far away, yeah? They might be producing a little cheaper, but every single goose is needed in Berlin, yeah? So it's not really like a competition that would kill the interests of the local farmers near Berlin, yeah? So that is one of the chapters I was initially planning to have in, but I don't think it really kind of killed the narrative, leaving it out, because I'm mentioning it, yeah, I'm at some point, but yeah, for the sake of the broader argument, I left it out, and that's in that folder now.
It seems like you could also marry that in an article with all of the material that you have sprinkled throughout here on smuggling and the differential prices on either side of the line, and what the speed of transport did, again, in an economic sort of under this radar point of view.
Yeah, so that's
a good project for a graduate student.
Yeah, let's write that article together.
Perfect. So we'll have more information on geese and smuggling activities coming. Are there any other questions right now or comments? They don't have to be necessarily questions. If not, I have something that I'm interested in, but I want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to speak. Okay, well, maybe then I'll move the ball forward by asking about disruptions. So you talk a lot about, of course, mobility, and especially, of course, in your last chapter on the First World War and in your epilogue, you talk about the disruptions in the railway and the disruptions to mobility. And I was interested if you could maybe speak a little bit more about disruption also in all kinds of different ways. For example, technological difficulties, people detained at borders, and anything one can really imagine that would disrupt mobility and that would actually cause people to get stuck in these border stations. And if there are any sort of stories in particular you want to highlight here that, you know, sort of emerged either from your Killed Darlings folder or from the book itself that you would like to maybe emphasize here.
I mean, what I would emphasize is basically that everything I observe that comes into being through this railroad line is something that we can observe today, right? So the idea of a well-guarded border, the idea of let's control who's coming into the country, let's set up, you know, a regime at the borders, yeah? That's something that emerges during this time. Yeah, with so many people traveling and so many people migrating, one of the consequences is that the politicians think, yeah, we actually have to somehow control it. Yeah, so with the railroad line does not only come more mobility and transnational mobility, but we also see that with the rising nationalism, we also see a better guarded borders, and we see the development of the modern border regimes. Yeah, so I think that's an important finding of the book, that we usually have two developments happening at the same time. Yeah, so we have increased mobility, but we also have yeah, the politicians in the capitals were trying to control this mobility. Yeah, so this goes hand in hand. So that's very important, I think. We have migrants who have the opportunity to travel and to reach the ports, but we also have the concerns of those living in Germany or in Prussia. Will they bring diseases? Yeah, what will happen if they stay? Yeah, so what they do, that they make sure that those people will leave the country as quickly as possible, not without leaving their money. Yeah, so one of the arguments I make is that we are talking too much about Ellis Island. Yeah, we're talking too much about Ellis Island. The real selection process, if we can call it this way, is happening at the Prussian Eastern borders, or if you want, also at the Habsburg borders. Yeah, because that is where the crucial health check is happening. Yeah, and many more people are rejected there than actually are rejected in Ellis Island. Yeah, so I think that's one of the findings, that we should change our focus away from the well-known places to the lesser-known places. Yeah, so I think if you want to understand the modern world, we should really look at the periphery. Yeah, because that is where many of the developments, yeah, are visible first before they're visible elsewhere. Yeah, and the way that people are treated at the borders is also kind of a mirror of how the whole society is acting. Yeah, and is treating people inside the country. Yeah, if you take migrants, for example, or if you take travelers. Yeah, so the border is kind of the business card of a country. Yeah, and you can see that at the huge railroad stations that were built. They were supposed to be entrance gates into the empires. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why they are so huge and so enormous. Yeah, so I think I didn't really answer your questions. Can you Can you kind of help me coming back?
I think you did. I think I was, excuse me, it was less of a question than, inviting you to talk more about these sort of tensions of these global localities that you talk about, right? It's very clear in your book, but I wanted you to kind of highlight these aspects.
Yeah.
I think you answered that. Yeah.
Whenever you live in a border region, you will understand how entangled these borderlands are in the past and in the present. Yeah, so there's a couple of people here who lived in Frankfurt Oder and on the Polish side. So this is also an entangled borderland. Yeah, and it has changed enormously over the last decades. Yeah, so we just celebrated 20 years of EU accession of Poland. And what this kind of opening of the borders has done to that borderland is kind of comparable to what the railroad has done to those historical borderlands. Yeah, so I think some of the findings are really kind of, yeah, can be translated into present day situations. I think that's important.
Very much so. Thank you. Gregor.
Yeah, I want to ask a question about the current situation of that wonderful bridge over the Vistula. The bridge of Dirschau today is, of course, a CHEF. And it's interesting, when it was built, it was on the one hand just an engineering accomplishment, a very important, very large bridge, very, very innovative, and it was copied a lot. And it was also, more recently, you wrote this in your book also, I forgot exactly the title, named as one of the big engineering wonders of the 20th century, together with the Hoover Dam and so on. So the bridge is still functioning as a railroad connection, but it was seriously damaged during the war. So the pillars are gone, the architecture is partly destroyed, but now it's under reconstruction. And I was wondering what the narrative is around that reconstruction, because what they reconstruct is a historical reconstruction. And once the bridge was connected to Marienburg Castle, so to Marburg, and so in its architecture, and Marienburg Castle was such an important nationalist monument and like a claim on Polish lands also. And now it's reconstructed. Of course, Marienburg Castle also has been reconstructed a long time ago, and it's a Polish national monument, Polish historical landmark. And what do they make of that connection that railroad bridge actually has to the landmark? Is this now a completely new context? Is this now a European monument, or what is it actually? So how do they engage with that? Those who reconstruct it and have to find money for it, have to make a case for it, why this should be historically reconstructed and not some other historical buildings in Poland, in case you know anything about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I followed that the legacy and also the fate of that bridge, of course, closely. So first of all, it has not been used as a railroad bridge for a long time. Yeah, the traffic was even like 10 or 20 years after the inauguration of that line, the traffic was getting so heavy that they had to build a new bridge. Yeah, so they built a new bridge next to the old one in the 1880s. Yeah, or early 90s. I had to look that up in my book. So they built a new bridge. So that bridge would be used as a road bridge. Yeah, and it has been used as a road bridge ever since, until it was closed in the 2010s. Yeah, in the early 2010s. And since then, as you said, it's been under reconstruction. And apparently it was very, very difficult to find funding for it because it didn't really serve a real kind of functional purpose anymore. Yeah, because at the time it was a major feat of engineering comparable to other large bridges like the Niagara Suspension Bridge or the Britannia Bridge. But technology went on very quickly. Yeah, and after 20 years, it was no longer the state of the art. Yeah, and I think that the strategy that the local actors are using today is not necessarily a European strategy, but it's even more a global strategy. Yeah, so because it has been, it's one of the sites. I think there's just 2 sites in Poland that are inscribed into the global civil engineering heritage. Yeah. By the American Society of Engineering, yeah, of Civil Engineering. So that is the point of departure, to show that it's an international example for a time that was maybe from today's perspective short-lived, because that was the state of the art for 20 years, yeah. But it's still a showcase, yeah, and it's also reason to be proud of it, yeah. And interestingly, I mean, you will find that everywhere that there's this strong connection in the iconography with Marienburg Castle, Marburg Castle, yeah. But that is not the most important marker today. That's no longer that important. I think what you can show with this bridge is also the many ruptures in history, yeah. So destruction, reconstruction. So some of the models of this bridge today are actually parts that were taken from other bridges, yeah. You can really see that in the design of the bridge as it is today, that it is kind of a reflection of this also century of destruction, the 20th century, especially the Second World War, of course, that this bridge has been a witness of. Yeah, and the strategy, I think, is more oriented towards a global importance of this place. Yeah, and of course that reverberates with the local communities. Yeah, so Czech is not a very important city if we compare it to the rest of Poland, let's say, but this makes it special. Yeah, so this is kind of the rallying point. Yeah, also for the local communities. Yeah, so I think it has lost most of its kind of national connotations, and it's really kind of become not even transnational, but even a global point of connotation, yeah, that you can make here, yeah, and a reason to be proud of the city and of the accomplishments. I mentioned it at some point in the book. I mean, the irony about this bridge is it was, of course, meant to connect different parts of the monarchy. It was kind of an international the outcome of international discussions of how to best build bridges across large, vast rivers. And then there's this German nationalist iconography in it, yeah. But when we look at who built the bridge, those were mostly Polish speakers, yeah. So that is important also to know, because they would draw the workers from the local regions usually, and they were all Polish speakers mostly, yeah. So that's important. So who built the bridge, the German nationalist bridge? The Poles, yeah. And so I think that's an example of how the intention of the government is different to, let's say, the intention or the tool that this bridge has become for the local community. Yeah. So I looked into local Polish newspapers of the time, because I was expecting to find something about, you know, the iconography and how it is kind of insulting, maybe. Yeah, because here come the big Prussians and the Germans and bring civilization to the region. But I couldn't find it. Yeah, there's no such idea that it's a bad thing that this bridge is erected here in this way. It's really seen as a chance for the local community. yeah, regardless of being Polish or German or whatever, or Jewish, yeah, as a chance for travel to get quicker to another place. The bridge was also the first permanent bridge, yeah, in this place, yeah, so it really had a very, very big meaning, yeah, and I think the iconography is impressive, but for the people living in this region, that was not so important.
Oh.
There is a question on the chat, so maybe you can, Carolina, I think there's a...
Okay, yeah, I see it. So I'll read it. This is from Ingo Schuster. This refers back to the Frankfurt-Oder and Słubice, the bridge. So unthinkable as students between Frankfurt-Oder and Słubice was the border still non-EU openings. The other was the semester tickets for traveling in small Brandenburg-Berlin connections, and Szczecin, Wrocław, Poznań are still post-COVID under many different travelers and attractions and divided businesses. And then Flix is offering direct travel Berlin to Gdańsk. So I think opening up these different connections and disruptions here with this particular border and this particular bridge.
Yeah, Ingo earlier makes an important point in Polish, speaking of dysfunkcja techniczna. Yeah, that's something that I also mention in this book. So today, when we hear cross-border railroad lines, and especially Eastern Europe, we always think of the different track gauge, right? And the real technical issue today is not the track gauge. The real technical issue in the European Union is the different systems on the railroad, yeah, so signals and so on. That's the technical difficulty. Like also the traction. How is it administered? So there's different systems of yeah, now I'm lacking the English word. The electricity is coming in different technical systems, yeah, and that is the real that is the technical border we have today. So it's no longer the political border. It's more that a technical border that still exists, and it's apparently very, very difficult. It's possible, but it's also very expensive to build locomotives, engines that will kind of able to cross those borders, yeah, unhindered, yeah. So I think it's yeah, we have to think more about the European dimension and the many difficulties that are related to crossing borders even today. Yeah, it seems like it's just a track. Yeah, but there's a lot behind this track. Yeah, there's a lot of different signals. There's a lot of technical issues that are related to border crossing today. Yeah, and they are much bigger than in the past. Yeah, so it's really, I'm really looking forward to see how they will manage at this border. Yeah, and how they will manage to kind of turn this railroad line again into a Polish-German one. As far as I know, now most of the trains will stop at the border, yeah, and then will change locomotives because of the different systems. So it's of course disruptive, yeah. At one point that the trains could go through, and that is of course much more effective. At this part of the border, it's still, yeah, very difficult, yeah. In the other major cross-European railroad lines, they already have this TEN system, a system where European homologization has worked. So yeah, so that's probably an answer to Ingo's question here. Yeah, and as I said earlier, the politicians and technology, they are kind of always 10 years behind of the needs of the people, yeah, who want to travel and who not necessarily want always to travel by car or want to take I think Ingo mentioned the Flixbus, yeah. So the railroad line has to be kind of put into yeah, into use again, and it's possible, yeah, but it's investments that take, yeah, almost decades.
Thank you. Are there other comments, Winston?
Sorry, I mean, when you talk about the technical difficulties, again, everything I know about railroads, I learned in the last couple of months from Austrian TV. And one of the problems here, of course, in with the Austrian railroads were the mountains, obviously, and they have different braking systems and had aligned brakes from the different sub lines so that they could work. But I guess one of the things differences, I mean, again, from this discussion, it seems like the railroad really was just sort of a transit route for goods, for people, but for the most part, sort of the steerage, the poor people to move from east to west. It sounds like, but it's not really identified. And this comes back to my question about the empires, but it's not really connected to, to royalty or to the emperors. And in Austria, that tends to be very different, right? In fact, even the carriages were upgraded all the time to try to sort of meet the needs of Sissi, right? To sort of make them as luxurious as possible. And then that sort of drove a lot of the technical innovations. They seem very luxurious. We think about the the Orient Express, right? As well. It doesn't seem like there's this mythos with the Ostbahn. And is there? Am I wrong, or is there something to it?
Yeah, there's a similar myth, and that's the Nord Express. Yeah, so the Nord Express was the fastest connection between Paris, London, and St. Petersburg. Yeah, and it was running on this Ostbahn track. Yeah. So yeah, in that one chapter on travel, I mentioned the Nord Express. It's without doubt very important. Yeah, and many people, the upper nobility, and also then, of course, politicians and who not traveled along with the Nord Express. Yeah, but the crucial thing we have to understand, that is not the majority of the people, as you said. Yeah, so that is maybe, I don't know, maybe 2% of the traffic on that line. Yeah. And the most important travelers, as you mentioned before, is those, yeah, let's call them steerage passengers. Yeah. So the people are traveling on fourth and third class. Yeah. And they are also the money makers for the railroad companies. Yeah. Because the sheer number, even if they pay less, the sheer numbers, that's what the railroad companies will succeed economically. Yeah, that's the reason why they succeed. It's not the upgraded royal car, or for example, in Eidkunen, you can the old station building that's no longer there. There is a royal waiting room, of course. Yeah, there is a royal apartment. Yeah, there is a first-class waiting room. There's a second-class waiting room, a third and fourth-class waiting room, and also restaurants for different classes. Yeah. So that is, of course, important, but it's more a showcase function. Yeah, it's not that important economically. Yeah, because important economically is the masses of people who travel. Yeah, so most of the books that you can find on international travel is about those travelers. Yeah, and that is a little unfortunate, because that is just 2 or 5% of the population, yeah, who are traveling the Orient Express or the North Express. Yeah, and so I was fascinated by this, and early on I thought, yeah, that makes a fantastic story. So let's talk about the North Express. But then when you really look into the numbers and the discussions, you'll see, yeah, the North Express, of course, important, but much more important is the third and fourth class. Yeah, the ordinary people. It's also much more difficult to track. Yeah, so I was really happy when I found, and this was really another coincidence, when I found this letter of the Lithuanian immigrant, yeah, in a Warsaw archive, yeah, who was describing his crossing the border and describing how we ended up in Eidkunen at the railroad station and how difficult it was to get on the train, yeah, because most of these 95% of the travelers, they didn't leave any paper trail, yeah, and so we have a mismatch in the description, yeah, in between the travel of the upper 2 or 5% and the 95% of the travelers who travel in a completely different way, but didn't describe it, yeah, usually. Yeah, and that's what I'm at least partially trying to remedy in this book.
Other questions or comments? We have time for maybe one more. Or any concluding remarks? Maybe Jan, is there anything you would like to kind of add as we conclude this discussion?
Yeah, what can I say? I mean, buy the book. It's probably the most important concluding remark, but write a review. So there is a link in one of the first pages of the book to a website that is still in the making. Yeah. So I had to struggle with the copyrights of the maps that I was trying to bring there. So it's now all settled. So in the next couple of weeks, there will be also an accompanying website here. Yeah, and then I think this book, especially in the conclusion, it opens up or asks also a couple more questions that we should probably deal with. And I don't know if there are any people in the room here. I think it would be really interesting also that some of the politicians involved in infrastructure planning today would read this book, yeah, because the discussions and the reasons why we create infrastructure are the same today, yeah, very similar. And I think that is one of the aspects that current politicians could learn of how to build a railroad line, avoiding the discussions that kind of, yeah, almost hindered the construction of these cross-border infrastructures. Yeah, and I think that's something we have to kind of expedite today. Yeah, to make Europe also work. Yeah, so maybe there's some inspiration in this book. Yeah, I'm a historian, so I'm refraining from any predictions for the future, but I see a bright future for this line. Yeah, but I'm not exactly sure when this is going to happen. But it's already happening. Yeah, as we speak. Yeah. And unfortunately, one of the reasons is the war in Ukraine, yeah, where the railroad has a different meaning now, yeah, with some of the Black Sea ports blocked. Many of the traffic and of the trade is now again on the railroad, and it's quite interesting to see how similar it is to the blockade of the Black Sea ports in the 1870s, yeah, when also the Ukrainian grain would go on the Prussian Südbahn and then on the Ostbahn to reach Western Europe. Yeah, and today again we are discussing this of how to bring Ukrainian grain on the railroad and to Western Europe and to the world markets.
Leslie, go ahead.
Oh, I would just like to add that I went to the website and I now look forward to its development, because I think bringing out the illustrations in that way will be extremely useful to the reader. And I want to thank you for writing this book. It is extraordinary in all the ways that Keely described. It's been a great pleasure to read it and read it again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your praise.
Thank you, Leslie. And these are actually beautiful concluding remarks here that I think really sum it up. And I've put the link to the website in the chat. And I'm really excited to hear that because it does have a note that there are some copyright issues. So I'm glad that this is coming and sort of adds to the richness of the study. And with that, I want to thank everyone for being here today. And again, on behalf of the Polish Studies Association, which I'm also linking to in the chat right now, I want to invite you to join us and to attend many more meetings that we will have and many more discussions. So with that, thank you. And I hope you all have a good summer, and we will see you at the next Polish Studies Association event. So thank you very much, and congratulations, Jan, on this wonderful book.
Thank you so much.